Okay, I think we'll get started. We are at just after 1:30. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Lohr, and I'm with the League of Arizona Cities and Towns. Welcome to the League webinar, Strategies for Dealing with PSPRS Unfunded Liability, Financing Options to Consider. We have a great session today and an excellent panel of experts, as well as some city and town and county representatives who are going to share their experience as well. This session will explore the history of PSPRS and how we've gotten to where we are now, as well as utilizing obligation bonds as a tool to refinance unfunded pension liability. Before we begin, I just wanted to make one housekeeping note. If you have a question for any of the speakers or the panel, please put your question in the Q&A section on your toolbar. This will be either at the bottom or at the top of your Zoom screen. That way we'll collect all those questions, and then the moderator will take those questions during the presentations and read those back, and then the panelists can answer those questions. I will now turn it over to Nick Ponder. Nick is the League's legislative director, and he oversees our PSPRS strategies. He's going to just give a brief overview of the importance of utilizing tools like obligation bonds when dealing with unfunded liability. So Nick, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. As Matt said, I'm the legislative director with the League. As many of you who are on the line know, I was first hired at the League in 2017 as a pension policy analyst coming over from the Arizona State Retirement System. So your first experience, many of your first experience with me was in the realm of pensions. One thing that we have been trying to do for over a decade, but more successfully in the last, I would say, 4 years or more, is to fix the system. Many of those fixes originated with pension statutory changes, as well as constitutional provisions, and then as well some board changes, actuarial changes, and things like that. PSPRS has been making many of those changes, but at the end of the day, your liabilities that predated pension statutory changes still exist. And so what we continuously try and identify is ways that we can help mitigate some of those expenses and possibly present some cost savings for our employers going forward. At the beginning of this pandemic and the historically low interest rates, CSA, County Supervisors Association, and the League began having discussions on how we might be able to go about this and take advantage of the historically low interest rates when compared to the 7.3% interest that you're accruing on your liabilities currently. So I will give CSA far more credit than the League. They've been pushing this quite hard. The League was focusing on a lot more federal issues at the time, but again, we continue to keep on top of this. I know that Mark has had some previous discussions, and the city of Flagstaff has found some significant opportunities up there to mitigate their costs and present some cost savings to them. So I just want to turn it over to Mark. Thank you guys for taking the time, and thank you, Mark, for your willingness to present.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to, on behalf of our firm, thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon. We wanted to thank the League for asking us to put together a panel of experts to discuss issues relative to PSPRS and introduce and discuss further this tool in our toolbox that you've probably heard about relative to the issuance of pension obligation bonds as a tool to potentially help manage the PSPRS liability. I think, as most of you know, we're a very active firm around the state, wherein we're helping our clients issue municipal bonds for public infrastructure projects. And during the course of our transactions over the past several years, we have been receiving more and more questions from investors across the country and from rating agencies relative to the PSPRS unfunded liability. So it's obviously been a growing and visible liability on our balance sheets. And so we've been getting more and more questions in connection with that, including several of our clients. So we've had several of our clients ask us for assistance in understanding the pension obligation bond tool. It started with this year. They were the pioneers in asking us to come into the room and assist. And I asked my colleagues from Chicago to come in, Rushta, who's going to be our moderator, Mustafa and Omar Dagestani, who's also going to participate. They are out of our Chicago office, and they have spent their entire careers working on pension bonds. So bringing them in has been very helpful to us, and interacting with our clients and putting together a very careful and very measured pension obligation bond financing. So they're going to join us and assist with the panel. I'd like to go ahead and make some introductions, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Rushta Mustafa, who will serve as the moderator. We're very pleased, as indicated on the slide here, to have Mike Townsend, the administrator of PSPRS, as you know, join us. I think his colleague Clark is also with us. My colleagues Omar Dagestani out of Chicago. And then we're very, very pleased to have our cities and towns and counties join us. From the city of Flagstaff, Greg Clifton, city manager, Rick Tatter, management services director, Brandy Suda, finance director. And as you may have heard, we worked with them and sold $131 million of taxable certificates of participation in July to fully fund their PSPRS liability. So we appreciate them joining us and them giving their views on why they elected to proceed from a policy perspective and a financial perspective to move forward. We're also pleased to have Pinal County with us, Angie Woods, the budget director, and Lori Pruitt, the finance director. We completed last week an $89 million taxable pension financing to address their PSPRS challenge. Very successful sale there. And we also recently completed a successful sale for Gila County at about $16 million on their pension obligation that we underwrote last week. And then lastly, we're very pleased to have Jeff Yates from the city of Tucson with us on the panel. The city of Tucson is considering this tool as we speak. They're going through the analysis and the public policy conversation, and we'll make a decision on that, I think, in the coming weeks or the coming month. So we've assembled a very experienced panel here that we think will help educate all of you who have dialed in further on this tool in the toolbox. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rushta Mustafa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we have this very exciting panel, I think, with such esteemed panelists to talk about what we're calling chopping down the mountain, addressing legacy pension costs for Arizona municipalities. So our hope with this panel is to be able to walk through sort of all aspects of what are the legacy pension costs that a lot of the cities and towns and counties and communities in Arizona are currently grappling with. And, to add color from that perspective, we have Mike Townsend and Clark Partridge from PSPRS, as Mark alluded, to help us understand sort of how we got to where we are today. And then once we get a firm grasp of sort of what the legacy pension costs actually are, or understand what this mountain is, we hope to be able to quickly discuss pension obligation bonds as a tool, and then have a chance for everyone assembled here today to hear from the cities of Flagstaff and Tucson, as well as Pinal County and Gila County. So without further ado, we understand that chopping down the mountain is a difficult task and we're not sure what tool we can use. So without further ado, I want to turn it to Mike Townsend and Clark Partridge so they can really help us understand the past, present, and future of the history of pensions in Arizona, particularly with regards to PSPRS and how we got here. what is the mountain? How did we get here? Mike and Clark, please help us learn.
Okay, thank you, Rushta. As Rushta said, my name is Mike Townsend. I've been the administrator at PSPRS since December, so a little less than a year. Have a lot of changes taking place. And in my approach, I'd really kind of starting at the beginning and get more of an understanding first before we start talking about the options and solutions, and really understand kind of where did this problem come from, what has been happening over the past couple of years that Nick Ponder mentioned in terms of reforms, so that we don't continue to dig this hole into the future, and then look at an understanding of how things work from the pension side, so that communities can look at options and potential solutions going forward. So go to slide 6. So kind of the past, how did we get here? There's obviously been a lot of things that I've been working on since I've been there with my staff to change, but I think from a high level, the biggest impact that we've seen from the past had to do with the PBI, the permanent benefit increase. And the permanent benefit increase was a way to provide funding for cost of living increases for retirees. I think the problem was, so the problem is really what were kind of those unintended consequences of the structure of how the PBI was put in place. And the first thing is how it was funded. It was funded with what was referred to as excess earnings. And so investment returns above 9%, half of those returns were actually taken out of the trust and set aside to fund benefit increases. And so those benefit increases would then increase the pension payments to retirees. So this kind of had a double impact on the trust. It would take assets out of the trust and then actually increase the liabilities on the other side. So it had a double impact in terms of funded status for the plan. Also, the way this was handled through the actuarial assumptions is the basic assumption is the assumed rate of return is what's going to be earned every year going into the future. And so the actuaries started out with an assumption that there would be no PBIs in the future. So there wasn't anything included in normal cost in the early years to account for the PBI. And you can see there by my point that there were actually 28 years of increases. And so not having that accounted for in the normal cost appropriately kind of led to the continual growing of that unfunded liability as assets were taken out and then benefits were increased on the liability side. The other part of this is once that was realized about how this math was starting to work, there were changes actually made to the investment portfolio and to reduce the volatility so there would not be those huge up years above the 9%. And so that also kind of tamped down what options were in terms of investments and reduce overall returns. So those things also had impacts on previous actual investment returns, just because of the way this structure worked, where you're taking out excess earnings, but you would keep all of the losses in the trust. If we go to the next slide. So in terms of what happened, in terms of the PBI, so
you would say in spite of our best efforts.
Yeah. Yeah, despite the weather, I'm having a good day. Yes.
Okay,
I'm so sorry. Someone's mic is not muted. If everybody who's not speaking could please mute their microphone. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're on slide 7. So in terms of the PBI from that big picture and what those impacts were, what has changed so that we don't continue that process? In terms of the PBI, Prop 124 and 125 were passed by the voters across the state that eliminated the PBI and put in place a new COLA that has a 2% cap, and that COLA is more consistent and more certain in terms of actuarial. So it is accounted for going forward. The actuarial assumptions, we also have new actuaries on board, and the Board of Trustees have voted to change some of the actuarial assumptions, including the amortization method of unfunded liabilities going forward to a closed layered system. Again, more consistent, more certainty going forward on how we pay down those liabilities. And then the investment allocations. We've changed the asset allocation back to taking advantage of all those different markets because we're not concerned with the volatility now with the elimination of the PBI, and also a lot of staff changes and new trustees in terms of the investment committee. So we go to the next slide.
Actually, Mike, I had a question here, which certainly not in the Q&A, but I think it's a question, that we hear frequently when we're having these conversations. And I'm sure you'll be touching on this, but I think over here, if you could elaborate, these changes that have been implemented and what changes is PSPRS anticipating, coming down in the next 2 to 5 year horizon, if any. And I think that's something, that obviously as people consider a permanent solution to the legacy costs, that's a question that does weigh on most of the community's minds.
So in terms of what I have on this screen, so the actuarial assumptions, we're continuing to look at that and updating the funding policy. So some of the other actuarial assumptions, we're obviously going to always be looking at the assumed rate of return to see if that needs to be adjusted. And so we're looking at those additional changes. The payroll growth assumption was changed. The amortization method that I talked about, going to a closed layered. So, and really the amortization method is the largest lever we have in terms of long-term funding and making sure we stay on track towards being 100% funded. So that's one that's really important. In terms of the investments, I think if you go to the next slide, Rushta. And that's a little bit further on. I'll get to more on the investment side and some of those changes as we go through the presentation. So also in terms of the changes that have been put in place to not grow the problem the way it was in the past, the pension reforms, again, that Nick Ponder spoke to, and the creation of tier 3. So that actually closed tiers 1 and 2, and that benefit structure, and created tier 3, which has lower employer costs, shared cost with the employees, and has some caps in terms of salaries and required the number of years to come up with the salary average, the cap on wages for the average salary. So there's several things that were put in place with tier 3 and closing tiers 1 and 2. I talked about Prop 124 and 125, eliminating the PBI, putting in place the COLA, and then those savings from all those reforms have actually, those savings system-wide amounted to almost $500 million. And those are already included in the actuarial valuations. So the thing to remember is when you look at it and you start thinking about pension reforms, those were put in place to not continue to grow the problem. But the one thing it did not do, it did not reduce the tier 1 and 2 unfunded liability. So those are those legacy benefit costs that have to be dealt with. And that's kind of the whole point of this session, is to look at those options and solutions. So if we go to the next slide.
And actually, Mike, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask them right now. And, I'm sure some of these you would be addressing in any case throughout your presentation. But question number 1 is from Rocio Garcia Pedroza from the city of Douglas, I believe. And her question is, will there ever be a possibility of all the funds being pulled together instead of being seen as individual plans? So I think going more to an ASRS type of a structure than PSPRS.
Right, and so I think that is sort of, that's really what, in essence, what happened with tier 3, because tier 3 has some of the large employers, the 17 larger employers actually have their own fund, but all of the others are going to be pooled together in tier 3. I think the problem with looking at something like an ASR structure is kind of the reason this was created this way back in the 70s was there's different funding levels. And so there'd be some that winners and losers of pulling those all together into one fund. And so who decides who the winners and losers are in this? So I think that's kind of the big challenge and the reason for not trying to do that with tiers 1 and 2, but looking more to creating tier 3 with the structure that we have. I saw Nick chime in here.
Yeah, I'm just gonna bring the political aspect of it and say that it's I would say a political impossibility for that to happen. There will be no pooling of tier 1 and tier 2. I think the question that we had asked early on to not necessarily Mark and Rushta, but some other folks in the bond space was, is there a way to pool some of the smaller communities' debts for the purposes of obtaining pension obligation bonds and getting the benefit of a larger or maybe a better credit rating? Our initial responses to that were pushed back, that we were told it was likely not possible. But to the point of actually pooling the plans of tier 1 and tier 2, as Mike said, it's really hard when you have, we were talking about the town of Tombstone yesterday, I think it was, who's funded well in excess of 100%. And we have other cities and towns who are funded at 20% or 40%. How do you coalesce around that? What is an adequate dollar amount for each entity, considering the aggregate plan funded status is around 45%? So that's just not going to happen. There may be other creative opportunities for financing, but not with respect to actually pooling the plan.
So Nick, you may want to stay on for this next question. I'll try to answer it first. Rushta, you want to read the question?
Thank you, Mike. I was just about to say the same thing. So the next question is from Philip Rodriguez, and I think it goes to that point of, tier 1 and 2 is locked, so perhaps there isn't a chance to pull that up. And if somebody takes care of that. So Philip's question is, if the state legislature addresses this in the future and somehow provides some relief, will the agencies that become 100% funded have any recourse to also be helped, or would they simply miss out on that relief? Thank you, Philip.
So just real quickly, I think Nick kind of covered the political side of that, but I think the other side is mathematical. If you look at PSPRS has a $9 billion unfunded liability. Compare that to the size of the state's budget. That is a huge issue. I don't know how the state could do that. The state, for just the state plans, is looking at close to $2 billion of an unfunded liability. I think the state is going to have its own challenges just dealing with their unfunded liability, let alone the rest of the state. Nick?
Yeah, there have been conversations in the past about some sort of statewide either sales tax or some other effort to address public safety in general. Obviously, Prop 207 is on the ballot this time. That's the recreational marijuana legislation. Part of that legislation allows for money to be allocated to public safety. The encouragement for many of you who are in difficult spots would be to try and put some of this towards your unfunded liabilities. With respect, again, from the political aspect, I just don't see the likelihood of addressing pensions on a statewide level. And I'm just going to be 100% honest with you and ask you to think about it from this perspective. We have an education system that assuming that Prop 208 doesn't pass, which it looks like it will, needs to be addressed. But we also have about $5 billion just in cities and towns, not including the counties, $5 billion in either deferred maintenance or road projects that need to be done from an infrastructure perspective. And then there's a myriad of other issues that the state could contemplate, and I'm sure that Clark could speak to that better than anybody. But the reality for pensions is you are required by law to make your annual required contributions. And from the legislature and the ninth floor perspective, if you're making those, if you're meeting those obligations, they have significantly greater and more imminent priorities as they see it to address than pensions where the employers are making those contributions. That would be my political analysis to that.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Mike, for answering those questions. And, of course, if there's follow-ups from Mr. Rodriguez, please do ask, and we will be sure to get an answer for that. So I just moved on to the next slide for you, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Rushta. And so along with the pension reform, some of the other changes that have been implemented internally at PSPRS, When I started last December, there were issues with the general ledger system not functioning correctly, some of the processes around cash and contributions. So we have implemented a new general ledger system starting July 1st. We've hired new auditors, Clifton Larson Allen. They're considered public pension experts across the country. Hired new leadership positions. After I started in December, I hired a new deputy administrator, Mike Smerick, who came over from GAO. Also have a new CFO, a new controller, new internal auditor. We also have our in-house financial consultant is Clark Partridge. He retired as the state comptroller. It's kind of an odd title, but his role is really to work with the actuaries, the auditors, the accounting staff, and employers to kind of be that liaison to help all of you understand how all of these different pieces work together. And I'm going to turn this over to him shortly so you'll get a chance to see Clark. Our actuaries, we hired the new actuaries. They put together the modelers for each system so each employer can actually look at how things work and analyze different options. A lot of IT security upgrades. We actually, from where we were 2 years ago, 80% of the IT staff are new. Investment opportunities, asset allocation. Again, with the new staff, the new asset allocation, and I'm going to go through another slide on that here shortly. The PSPRS board adopted those actuarial changes to eliminate negative amortization and get us, and again, the amortization method is kind of that big lever we have to keep us on track. The advisory committee has been re-engaged and actually provided a lot of input in terms of the changes to the actuarial assumptions and that ongoing stakeholder engagement. The advisory committee is made up of both members and employers. It includes representatives from the fire districts, the county supervisors association, and the League of Cities. So if we go to the next slide, a little more. So on the asset side, kind of the big change that we've made in terms of the asset allocation over the past couple of years. In the past, some of the issues have been around being heavy, whether it was in the tech sector leading up to the dot-com bubble or in real estate leading up to the real estate housing collapse. So really, when you look across all large institutional investors, this is information from a study that lays out really what happens. Most of your returns, over 90% of what you get from returns, is really based on your asset allocation. It's not picking winners or losers or trying to time the market. That doesn't work. It hasn't worked in the past. And so this is where we're going, is changing. In the staff we have are working on asset allocation, making sure we're diversified, we're in the right sectors to achieve those returns over the long term. So go to the next slide. This is just a link I have here on how PSPRS investments work. If anybody's interested, if you want to take time to go through that. So the next one.
And I'll just say, for the benefit of the audience, that the presentation will be available and distributed through the league later for that link. Sorry, Mike, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rushta. Okay, so I kind of covered the past and then the changes that have been taking place. And so as you going forward into the future, looking at solutions for that legacy benefit that's out there, the unfunded liabilities, I wanted to kind of go through a quick discussion to understand exactly what are the unfunded liabilities and how does the math work, because that's important to understand. So we go back to slide 12. So when we look at the unfunded liability, first thing is to look at the assets, and we're looking at the value of the assets today. What are they on the market? So each fiscal year end, we take an inventory and value the assets. On the liability side, the actuaries look at all of your demographics for your population and come up with estimates about how long they're going to work, how much they're going to earn in retirement, how long they're going to be drawing those pensions in retirement. And so what are all of those future string of benefits going to be in the future? And those are discounted back to a present value. So when you look at the liabilities in the actuary evaluation, that's not a future number, that's a present value number. And that's very important to understand. And Clark will go through some of the math on that to explain why that is so important. So the unfunded liability is just the difference between those two numbers. And so that unfunded liability is the unfunded portion in today's dollars. So if we go to slide 13, the funded percentage. Funded percentage is just a division, right? It's using those same numbers, the plan assets today, and then the present value of those liabilities in today's dollars. The goal is to be 100% funded, but if you're 100% funded, you need to remember that you're 100% funded today. That's a present value number. So going forward into the future, your members are going to continue to accrue additional benefits. They're going to earn more going forward. And year to year, we're going to look at what are the investment returns, and the actuaries year to year are going to look at your demographics. How many of those retired before they thought they were going to retire? How many are living longer in retirement? What are your disability numbers? So those are different risks that we have going forward. Just getting to 100% funded in today's dollars does not make this problem go away. We really need to continue to look at it going forward and understand the investment and the actuarial risk. Okay. This is a breakdown across the entire plan. So you can see most of the plans kind of fall in that middle, that 25 to 50 and the 50 to 75 in terms of the number of plans, but also the dollars of the unfunded liability. So most agencies out there have an unfunded liability. So this is not unique to one or two. This really is a problem across the whole plan. Okay. So the pension funding equation, as Clark goes through some of this, this is going to be important for all of you to understand. The right side of this are the uses of funds, the benefits and expenses, the benefits being those retirement payments, and the benefits really are the largest number on this page. The left side of this formula are the sources of funds, contributions and investment income. And that's really going to be key as you start to look at options. The investment income are things we're doing what we can around asset allocation, but if we don't have the funds there to invest, we can't really get the return. So really what it comes down to is how do we get the contributions in, because that's really the one number you have control over. Get the contributions and have the money there and take advantage of that opportunity for investment returns going forward into the future. So we go to the next slide. As we talked about, kind of the winners and losers, we can't pool everybody together, everybody's separate. So we're looking at over 260 different plans that we all have. And those unfunded liabilities have been earned, and they're subject to the pension clause and legal precedent. So it really is a debt. It's going to be paid. And the important thing from that pension funding equation on the previous page, the amount and the timing of these contributions will directly impact your plan. So every additional dollar contributed can earn investment returns in the future. But also every additional dollar not paid in is a lost opportunity for those returns. So that's something that is important to understand. The next slide is, so when we look at those contributions and how we calculate this, because when we break this down about those opportunities and where the dollars come from on the next few slides, there's normal cost. I talked about those liabilities being a present value number. So that's as of today. So for your members that are continuing to work next year, they're going to earn another little piece of that pie of future benefits. So what they earn in that current year is what we refer to as normal cost. The other part of the contributions comes from the unfunded liability. Is how do we pay down that unfunded liability? It's amortized similar to a mortgage. So that number is calculated, and the two numbers added together are how we come up with the number for the contribution rate that applies to your payroll.
If I may interject here, Mike, then for tier 3, for example, there is no unfunded liability. So then the member participant's contribution is just the normal cost for that component.
That's correct. If it's fully funded, it's just the normal cost going forward in future years. And
if they did do a fix that got them to 100% funding, they would still be contributing.
Correct. Okay. This is system-wide. We'll get into, Clark is going to get into a specific example of how this works. But each year, if you look at the cash coming into the system on a system-wide basis, you can see 55% is coming from contributions and 45% from investment income. If we were better funded, had a higher funded percentage, then more of that cash each year would be coming from investment returns. And so that's that opportunity that I was talking about. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over now to Clark Partridge to go through a specific example of one of our employers.
Thank you,
Thank you, Mike. We'll go to the next slide. And this is an example of a city, and you can see, Mike, you went through the system as a whole. But here you have the total present value of the liabilities is approximately $120 million here. There's assets of approximately $54 million to cover that, which leaves about $68 million in an unfunded liability. So that's that piece that from the tiers 1 and 2 that still needs to be covered. And as Mike had said, through all the pension reform, it essentially went through a triage and stopped the bleeding, stopped digging the hole deeper, but now we have to fill the hole. And that unfunded liabilities is the piece that we need to crack. And we do that by trying to grow the assets to get that investment return that Mike had talked about. If we move to the next slide, this will point out in a table format, another way to view some of this, that and what the dynamics are that are going on. You can see that there are increased assets coming into the plan. There's investment earnings, and there's also contributions. In this case, the investment earnings are a little less than $4 million during fiscal year 19. And there's also additional contributions of $6.7 million. So you'd think that you're making really good progress because you're contributing over, $10.5 million towards the plan. The problem is if you look on the liability side, that you're also getting one more year recognized of that amortization of the unfunded liability. So that totals just shy of 9 billion. So if you look at the difference between that, you're really not making up just about, $1.7 million there is all the ground that's being made up. And that unfunded liability is really not getting decreased to the extent that you'd like. So there's a number of those actuarial assumption changes that the board has recently done to help take care of that. But a big chunk of this is how do you contribute dollars to get to solve this problem? So we go to the next slide. This is another way to look at the same issue. Again, you can see in 2019 what that total liability is, how much were assets on the bottom and also liabilities on the top. And then you can see in 2020 how, yes, there's additional contributions. The assets have gone up, but also so is the total liability. So you're just chasing after that and again, not making the progress. And you can see here again, that change in liabilities that increased from 122 to 130. But you can see that there's a slight improvement in the unfunded portion from 68 million dropped down to 68.3 approximately. So let's move. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so in other words, we could say that the unfunded liability really is a loan that an entity has with PSPRS that's accruing at a very high interest rate of the actuarial rate of 7.3%.
Yeah, correct. That it's that assumed rate of return, which is what the same thing that you use, and that's in accordance with the GASB standards to discount the the net present value of those retirement benefits and what that liability is. On this slide here, you have a pie chart, and this shows, you saw before, what the overall pension system is. This is an example for this city where you have the normal costs coming from the employee and the employer, totaling 17%. You have the investments that are contributing 37%, but you have this unfunded actuarial contribution that is needed, which is 46%. And when it gets to where you're paying such a larger percentage of your normal costs in your unfunded actuarial contributions side, that's what's causing your contributions to go up so dramatically. If we move on to the next, this is an example of what the contributions would be, obviously, if it's 100% funded. 83% would be covered by the investment earnings. And then the normal cost, the 8% from the employee and the 9% from of the employer on the normal cost, would be what comes from the employer contributions. So that's what a normal, fully funded contribution percentage would look like. So I'll now turn this back over to Mike, and he can wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Clark.
Okay, so getting back to that formula, that pension funding equation, again, on the left side, those sources where the money comes from is really, it comes from two places. And how do we take advantage of the investment returns is really through the contribution side. And so over the long term, I had the actuaries put this together. So an additional $1 million invested would actually save taxpayers $1.8 million over that 17-year amortization cycle. So having those additional contributions up front, if we're earning the assumed rate of return, it's going to pay back. And also at the end of that 17 years, you still have the original $1 million still in the fund, still earning investment returns. So, and the other thing too is I really wanted to point this out again. I think I hit on it earlier, but it's really important about that continued diligence. Is even if we get to 100% funded, even if we're in a good place on tier 3, there's always going to be investment risk and actuarial risk as we go forward, because the actuaries are making estimates, they're making assumptions about these costs. So we really need to understand that and manage that in going forward, both PSPRS and the employers.
Well, thank you very much, Mike and Clark. I'm going to pause for a second and see if we have any questions from our audience for Mike and Clark from PSPRS. This has been tremendously helpful, and they will be around if you have questions for them later. Hearing nothing, I will move on to our next panelist, Omar Dagestani from Stifel, who has had a career in doing pension financings for issuers nationally. And, we want him to give us a little bit of a POB 101, so to speak. But before we get into that, I think, thank you very much to Mike Townsend and Clark Partridge from PSPRS for, that excellent and informative discussion. And my key takeaways from that were that, firstly, we have to understand the unfunded liability as a loan or a debt from PSPRS that's growing at 7.3% and just sort of paying it down at the actuarially required contribution rate, especially initially. Like any loan, you're making more interest payments than principal payments to repay that debt, if you think about it like your mortgage. And the other key takeaway is the continued diligence, that even if you put in place measures to get to 100% funding, that's 100% funding in today's dollars. And so there's that, the investment risk and the actuarial risk going forward that Mike alluded to. So with that, we're going to get into Pension Bonds 101. And I'd like, Omar, if you could help us understand what is this tool? I mean, we're saying this is an opportunity for some of the constituent units within PSPRS to chop down the mountain or to repay that loan to PSPRS and achieve 100% funding. So if you could explain how it works, what are the advantages and considerations, and what are the risks, and as well that continued diligence piece. Are there opportunities for the cities and towns and counties to implement measures that can help them manage that risk going forward?
Hey, thanks so much, Rishta, and thank you, Matt and Nick and the Arizona League of Cities and Towns for having us today. This is a topic that I've spent the vast majority of my career for the last 18 years thinking about and working on, both from a debt perspective as well as from a broader asset liability match perspective. The one point that I know Clark and Rishta and Mike made, as well as Gasby, is that unfunded pension liability is or behaves a lot like that. It is certainly the most expensive liability, accruing at 7.3% a year when unfunded. And that's more or less the opportunity cost of not having it invested in the market as you would otherwise anticipate. And when you consider that, it's not surprising that in a particularly low interest rate market, a lot of people are considering this tool, not only in Arizona, but I would tell you really across the nation. And indeed, I've worked over my career from coast to coast on this topic. So if you look on page 26 here, one thing I would say, you could draw all of the schematics and so forth and consider all of these things, but ultimately, when you consider a pension financing, you're looking at replacing that liability that's accruing at 7.3%. In Arizona, it's a liability that's constitutionally protected, even post Prop 124 and some of the other reforms. And so in that respect, the question is, can I fund this at a rate that is lower than 7.3? And you do so simply by funding that fully or partially, depending upon your goals and needs, and then replacing it with a debt financing. In many instances, back in the day, most people were happy if they could get to 5 or 6% borrowing rates. Now we're regularly seeing people achieve at or below 3%, maybe even 2%. We'll talk about that in a minute. I would also say there's certainly no cookie cutter relative to structure, amortization, reserve funds, credits, all of those things. Each of these financings is very custom tailored, and I know our team is very proud of really trying to match the needs of each of the folks that we're fortunate enough to work with. If we advance to the next slide, please. One of the big risks, if you consider a pension bond, that people think about, you're going to, do your research, and there are many good things that come with pension bonds. There are many bad things. And when I consider those are largely a question of risks and how well they've been anticipated and managed within the confines of a debt financing. Now, the number one risk is market risk. And this is a risk that you have whether or not you do a pension bond, in the sense that if PSPRS earns less than 7.3%, or its assumed rate, whatever it might be at that time, there's going to be a new liability that merges. If it earns more than that, you're going to be ahead of the game. Now, relative to a pension bond, your primary risk is that the investment return over the lifetime of the bond is one, could be less than the actuarial rate, in which case your anticipated savings would be different. But two, and more importantly, you have to think of this in the context of your borrowing rate. If you're borrowing at, call it 3%, if you don't think that you're going to earn, or PSPRS is going to earn 3% over the next 20 years on average, you shouldn't do a pension bond. You'll be worse off for having done it. If you think that PSPRS will earn more than 3% over the next 20 years, you'll likely be better off. And obviously that's an assessment that you and your financial advisor, investment advisor, and finance team need to consider. Actuarial risk. A lot of people talk about market risk, but in fact, I think about actuarial risk with the vantage point of 18 years, having done close to 17 billion of pension bond transactions in my career now. Actuarial risk is the one that really, people always think about market risk because it's very tangible. But in fact, I hope nobody on the line is an actuary. I was going to tell a joke. I'll skip the joke, but I would share and reflect that the difference between an introverted and extroverted actuary. An extroverted actuary looks at your shoes when they talk to you. Now, of course, in the COVID era,
I will let the audience know that not that I'm an actuary, but kind of. So thanks, Omar. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. And actually, we do have a question. I apologize. We do have a question. I will let you complete your thought, but I wanted to put that out there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But actuarial risk specifically is, you look at all of the things in an actuarial report, and your liabilities are calculated premised upon those things being met. One of the big things that has happened over the last 18 years is that people are living longer. Those small increases in longevity over year are great news, right? I mean, people are living longer, they're living healthier. They're great news for the world, for our nation. They're lousy news for pension math. And it's something, if you're to look at year losses, not just in PSPRS, but if you're to look at across the nation, and Rishta and I and our entire team has looked at hundreds and hundreds of plans across the nation. Actuarial risk is probably a bigger one. I would reflect whether or not you do a pension bond, that risk is there, but it's one that is worth considering when you're looking to structure that. There are any number of other risks, and those are things, again, custom tailored. But before we move on, I wanted to share with you 3 never befores in my life. One, never before in my career, and again, I've looked at pensions coast to coast, have I worked with a more involved, committed, dedicated chief administrator like Mike Townsend and Clark Partridge and the team over at PSPRS. They've been directly involved in every pension financing and consideration of that policy tool, looking at the relative merits, pro and con, with every town and county and employer that has had that interest. And I would reflect that is an incredibly different circumstance, and really, you know, Mike and his team are gold to Arizona and doing so much public policy good. Number 2, never before in my career have I seen 3 issues, all pension issues, all achieve all-in ticks less than 3%. That's an incredible testament to the strength of the credits and the thoughtful public policy decisions that Flagstaff, Gila, and Pinal have made. And, you know, I have to say, you know, never before in my career have I had so many great public policy conversations with the team in Flagstaff and Pinal and Gila and Tucson, Yuma, Douglas, and others. And I just, I want to thank you all for that. I know when I see the presenters here and, you know, to see familiar faces, Greg and Rick and Brandy, Hamachu, Leo, Lori, Angie, for Gila, Mary, Marin, James, and Tucson. You'll be hearing from Jeff in a little bit as well. And I know Joyce is joining us as well. Yuma, Gil, and Ian. And finally, in Douglas, you have Dawn, Luis, and Marcio. Just incredible public policy discussions. And it really underlies the one point, if you take away one point from this seminar, it is that this is not a cookie cutter borrowing. This is a large public policy decision you're making. And when you consider your team, consider people that you want to be talking with for the next 20 years, because, you know, there's a lot of ways to manage that. And I realize I've probably talked beyond that, and I realize there's some questions, so I'll turn it back to Rishta.
Thank you, Omar. That is extremely helpful. And we do have a question from Mr. John White. Omar, I would appreciate, I'd appreciate obviously, of course, always your perspective, but I do believe also, Mark Reeder, if you are on the line, if you're able to help us answer this one. And the question is, what about coverage and other debt-related limits and ratios associated with debt that might not be affected by unfunded pension liabilities? So I think, going to the point of you're converting a soft liability into a hard liability, and that will, if you're bonding against that, that's going to impact your GO, PRO, or COP.
Right. And John, that's a fantastic question. It's one that I think every town and city and county and other type of employer has to consider relative to coverage, debt limits, credit vehicles available. If I'm to look at some of the types of credit structures that have been used so far, certificate of participation, you can take assets and fully or partially collateralize that. And largely, investors are looking towards the credit of an underlying town or city or county. And we've received really good feedback in the market. There are obviously other revenue and other types of credits where, I think a coverage analysis relative to your entire debt portfolio is germane and relevant, and something that is a consideration of this type of strategy. And, to me, I think if there are specific revenues that there's room to pledge and you look at your future capital program and you think there's room for that can make a lot of sense. And or if not, the COP route has been very well received in the market, and you don't necessarily need to reach the entire level of collateralization, because largely it becomes an appropriation credit, which is congruent with Arizona law and statute, but it's also congruent with best practices nationally.
Thank you, Omar. And I think that actually segues very neatly into our next panel participants. So before we move on, and I'm sure everyone's most interested and excited to hear from the esteemed panelists that we have from the cities of Flagstaff and Tucson and Gila County and Pinal County. But before we move on, I just want to draw everyone's attention to the bottom half or the bottom section of this slide here, which is, can the city implement safeguards to mitigate these risks? This goes back to, sort of the running theme that Mike Townsend alluded to, as well as Omar, that there are risks. A lot of these risks are inherent to pension plans and to actuarial calculations in general. And of course, they're enhanced if you're doing a pension financing. However, because you are doing a refinancing and you're essentially lowering your borrowing rate from that 7.3% to, let's say, 2.8% or 2.5%, you have the capacity to take some of those savings up front and establish reserves that can help you manage that market risk and actuarial risk. And with that sort of prelude, sorry, Omar, go ahead.
Thank you, Rishta. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Omar. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. And with that, I will turn it over to the city of Flagstaff. And we have Mr. Rick Tatter, who is Management Services Director for the city, and he is going to kick us off talking about the rise and fall of Flagstaff Mountain of pension debt.
Thank you, Rushta. With me also today, and we'll be tag teaming, is Greg Clifton, our city manager, as well as Brandy Suda, our finance director. And we appreciate the opportunity to tell our story from the city of Flagstaff's perspective of the rise and fall of our mountain of pension debt. And while in Flagstaff, we do love our mountains, we love seeing them snow-capped or with the fall leaves covering. But the pension debt was one mountain we were watching, and we were struggling with managing the continued growth of the unfunded liability. So we're going to give you a historical perspective, some of the actions we took in 2020, and then a recap and results for this pension financing we did. So just as a perspective, the city of Flagstaff does have two pension plans. One is a fire and one's a police pension plan. As of June 30th last year, our pension plans were 37% funded and had a unfunded actuarial about 112 million. So over the years, it's continued to grow, and we'll talk about those numbers in a little bit. The annual increases is something that we've been dealing with our budget process. It seems like the last 10, 15 years trying to manage those annual increases. And currently, we actually apply about $10.5 million toward our unfunded actuarial liabilities. And we have that as an ongoing budget in our plans. So let's look at what's the mountain that we're speaking to. Next slide. So this slide shows a few things. The green line is our accrued pension liability over time, starting in 2003 up to our latest actuarial report. And why we start in 2003 is that's when we were 100% funded in our plans. And after that, the amount began to grow. The blue line represents the trust assets for our plans. This is combined. And then the red line is the mountain that we're trying to manage and take care of during this pension finance. So you can see from 2003 to 2006, in just 3 years, our funding plan went down to 75% in just that short period. And our actuarial liability increased by $18 million in just that short period. You fast forward another 7 years, and that's the point where we were only at 50% funded. And you could see that unfunded liability grow to $54 million in that time frame. The annual contributions from 2003 to 2013 grew by almost $3 million in our organization. But you could see it just continued to grow after that point. And now we're sitting with the latest actuarial report that was provided for June 30th, 2019. We were only at 37% funded, and our liability continues to grow. It grew by about another $4 million in just this last year to $112 million. Next slide. So our plans, Mike showed how a lot of the plans match up within the pension plan, but this is a comparison nationally of PSPRS. They are mostly in the 40 to 59% range of funded plans, but the city of Flagstaff is below what PSPRS funding levels are. We are down in the lower quartile of a funded plan for our pension plans, and this was just alarming to us, and we knew we had to move ourselves to the right on this slide. And how do we do that is a conversation we were having with council. Next slide. So some of the things we've been doing over the last several years prior to the beginning of this fiscal year is in 2014, there was a pension task force, and we were fortunate that our management service director at the time, Barbara Goodrich, was an active participant in that task force. And we really learned a lot from that group and the work they did to bring information forward for cities to understand, cities, counties, town, and districts. It was a very eye-opening process. And the pension task force submitted a yardstick report for the community, for the cities and so forth. And it was a very good report. And I hope many of you actually saw the report, read the report, learned a lot more about your pension plans. And within that report was an appendix for employers. This is where we took a lot of the recommendations back in 2015 to help our plan to get us in a better location for the city of Flagstaff. And, you know, staff was keeping an eye on this, council was keeping an eye on this, and we made many of these recommendations. 5 of the 6 recommendations the city actually implemented over time. We budget contributions for our drop members, even though we're not required to. When people move to the drop, we continue to provide that funding to the plan. We prepay our budget contributions in July of each year, and we do it based on the budget, and we don't make adjustments at year end to bring back monies should we have overfunded the plan. We didn't defer the impact of the Fields case, and we look to opportunities to pay off the unfunded liability earlier. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And of course, everybody now creates a funding policy. In 2018-19, there was one thing where it kind of took us back a little bit, and we made a decision as a city of Flagstaff to actually extend our police amortization plan to 30 years. The purpose of this was a retention issue. We were having difficulties retaining our police officers, weren't able to give them to the compensation increases that we were looking for. And we wanted to take a step to provide a merit to many of our sworn officers. So we took the opportunity, extended the plan, and while the merits only costed, you know, $350,000, the plan saved us about just under $1 million a year in our contributions. But we didn't pocket that into our funds, into our budgets. We didn't reduce our budget line items. we continue to pay the excess $600,000+ into the plan to shorten that 30-year period for that police amortization change. So while we made the decision to extend, we may also made a decision to continue increased contributions. One of the biggest steps that our council made occurred last year. Last spring, we had the conversation about our use tax. In the city of Flagstaff, it was a 1% use tax rate. And they agreed to increase the use tax rate to match what our tax rates are on things like retail and commercial contracting and so forth. By increasing that rate last year, we're looking to provide an additional $900,000 to our annual contributions, and we designated that all to the Public Safety Pension Fund. That, along with the policy measures we took, really aligned us to where we're eliminating that negative amortization portion. We're contributing $2 to $2.5 million excess a year with all these items implemented for the city of Flagstaff. Over the years, we really took advantage of those educational opportunities. And, you know, I recommend that you take any opportunity to learn more about our pension plans and your options and what you can do to better your organization. This is actually the third time we're doing this presentation to individuals that are interested. We did it for GFYZ. A few weeks ago, we gave a presentation to the PSPRS board because they were very interested. But it seems like each time you listen to these educational opportunities, you pick up on a few things that may help benefit your organization. So education is really key to understanding your plans. And nope, go back. And over time, our funding status really did stabilize. You know, we're at the 37% for a few years now. However, the bigger concern is that unfunded liability consistently grew year after year. And like I mentioned earlier, $4 million increase, even though we're making some measures, just wasn't making the progress we wanted. So the bigger concern of the UAAL kept council involved. It kept them concerned, and they really pushed us to look for bigger and bolder changes to address our pension funding. And with that, we kick off the year of 2020, and I'll kick that off to City Manager Greg.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick. A nice beginning to the story. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in 2020, and I'll move along pretty quickly here with these slides. Ushta, so thanks for helping me out. As Rick mentioned, we were chipping away at the issue, but we were not making big strides. And we were aware of that every year during the budget time, and last year was no different. So we endeavored to try to come together, staff and council, to recognize the magnitude of the problem, and also to recognize the need to do something significant, to go big in resolving this. In order to go big, and especially to bring council on board to that level, we decided to bring in some outside expertise. So in January, we reached out to Stiefel, talked about some options. In February, we shared that with the staff, talked about general obligation bonds, sales tax increases, pension bonds. We also talked about certificates of participation at that point. And then in early March, we went out and met with PSPRS and again with Stiefel, and had more detailed conversations. Mind you, this is all pre-COVID, and so COVID has not happened, the recession has not happened. We're just doing this in an effort to take some big strides. Next slide, please, Ushta. Mid-March, end of March, the pandemic arrives and everything changes, of course. I don't think our council had much of an appetite for a ballot measure prior to then. They certainly did not after the pandemic came. And, you know, It was not the year to be going to the voters. So the priority was to solve the funding issue. We were working closely with Stifel and with PSPRS to develop some strategies. We identified the certificates of participation as the best option. Next slide, please, first. We talked about risks. Certainly there are some, and we looked at those risks in detail. The bullet points I would like to bring to your attention on this slide are the last two. The second to the last one is that the minimum payments of $10.3 million, that it was going to increase our minimum payment by 10.3 million in the year 2036. From a budgetary standpoint, that wreaks havoc on anybody's general fund budgets to try to absorb that kind of increase over the amortization schedule. The labor cost, inclusive of our pension, we're hovering around 69%. Again, a big impediment to trying to have effective budgeting year in and year out. Next slide, please. Rick talked about the mountains. Here you have it graphically displayed. We don't have one mountain here, we have two to deal with in terms of our pension. You're seeing in blue the fire, in gold the police, and so two different amortization schedules, two different peaks, and you can certainly visualize that 2036 peak that I just made reference to. Next slide. So in an effort to mitigate the risks that we had identified, we came up with in talking with Stifel, came up with a contingency reserve fund. And we talked at length about that with our counsel. I think without a contingency reserve, the risk becomes a little bit significant. And so with the reserve, we're able to mitigate that. So we set up this fund with internal contributions to allow us to better absorb any sort of downturn in the economy over that amortization period. Next slide. In the 2020 timeline, it seems like a long time ago, it was just a few months ago. On April 23rd, we had a big budget retreat with our council, and we had Stifel and we had PSPRS. It was a great lineup, heavy hitters, and we had a great presentation with council. And we got into the weeds in this thing, and we talked a lot about the risks. The one thing I want to mention back to managing risks, it became evident to us, and it was really hammered during this retreat, that our biggest risk was not doing anything at all. We could not deal with the high encumbrance upon our general fund in the yearly budget process, and we certainly couldn't deal with the risk of seeing those increased costs in that amortization schedule that you saw with the two mountain peaks. So we had to do something, and we had to make it meaningful. We wanted to go to 100% funding, and that's what we recommended to council. Council agreed. Frankly, I think with the assistance of the Stifel team, who you're hearing from today, and with Mike Townsend with PSPRS, we really hit this home with council that we needed to take big measures moving forward. And now with the pandemic in play and the recession happening, we knew we could realize some pretty favorable interest rates. So the timing worked in our favor. We had a unanimous council to move forward with certificates of participation, which enabled us to do this without going to the voters and without incurring any additional debt or having to increase taxes or any revenue stream. So next slide. And this is, I think, the most meaningful slide for us today. You see the two mountain peaks, the amortization schedules. You see what we were budgeting in the yellow line. And then you see what the takeaway is on this issuance this year, which is the blue line, which is a lesser debt payment each year, but more importantly, a shorter amortization schedule. And in the last few years of that schedule, actually saving money. So a significant help to the city, an easier way for us to budget, and huge savings going back to the 7.3% that's been referenced. We knew we can come in well under that, and we did. Next slide, please. And I think I will end on this slide and then turn it over to Brandy in just a second. But we wrapped up this process, the budget process, and this issuance with council adopting an ordinance to issue the certificate of participation. That occurred in June. And then after that, we pledged a number of city facilities. We had a $52 million insured value on those facilities, representing about 40% of the entire issuance. I think we did quite well on that. In other words, we had to encumber just 40%, or the buildings, facilities that we encumbered represented 40% of the issuance, which was rather remarkable. And the council also agreed to the contingency reserve fund, which was put into place by a separate action. And then later in the summer, we were able to close. And I'm going to let Brandy Suda talk to you about what happened there and just how much money we saved in doing this issuance last year. Brandy, are you ready to take over?
I am. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
So when we looked at what exactly we wanted to issue and how we wanted to size our debt service for certificates of participation, with the goal in mind that we wanted to be at 100% funded, we had to kind of project what those changes in our unfunded liability would be since our last actuarial report that was dated June 30th of 2019. Some things that we considered were, market impacts. Due to COVID, we knew we weren't going to hit that 7.3% for PSPRS rate of return. So we built that into the projections. We also looked at our market value versus actuarial value of our assets to adjust for those differences. We looked at projected negative amortizations that were scheduled in our amortization schedule, as well as we had some prepaid balances from fiscal year 20 and planned prepayments for 21, and we used those in consideration for our debt service. So in the end, we ended up depositing $115.5 million with PSPRS versus our actuarial liability as of June 30th of 2019 of $112 million. Also, as part of that sizing of the debt service was estimated our contingency reserve fund. And so we really looked at it as two separate areas. We have our market reserve. So planning for those times when we do see declines in the market, that we have that money to backfill should we see those. Also actuarial reserves for any time we see are projecting any future changes in our actuarial assumptions, such as a change in our investment rate of return, what that impact would be if we went from the 7.3% to a 7%, as well as other changes such as salary increase assumptions, payroll growth assumptions, mortality table assumptions, any of those changes, so that if those things happen in the future, we can pull from this reserve to continue to be at 100% funding. And in the end, we ended up depositing and calculating a value of $14.2 million, 7.4 for our fire and 6.8 million for our police.
And Brandy, for the benefit of the audience, could you explain where the CRF is held in terms of, this is not money that's deposited with the PSPRS deposit. This is money that the city controls.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have this in a separate fund within the city. We make sure that it's very liquid, meaning that we can have quick and easy access to it. So as we get new actuarial reports, we see changes in our actuarial liability, we can draw on that fund very quickly and get back to 100% funded. And we also have policies in there and how we, should we draw down on those reserves, how to get them back to those levels.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
I think one of the other key takeaways from 2020 is we made many presentations throughout this process, including with our meetings with S&P and Fitch for our ratings, working on those presentations. We did receive a AA- stable rating for both agencies. So, and we saw no decline in our ratings due to recent events, due to COVID and other things. We also met with bond insurance agencies. While we didn't end up going this way, we had many meetings with different bond insurance agencies. We did record a presentation for potential investors. That was a first time for me. And then had various meetings with the Stiefel underwriting team so that they could really understand why we were making this decision and how it was the best decision for the city. And with that, we went to market on July 23rd. Moving on to the results. So in the end, our key achievements of this transaction included, we are now 100% funded for our city's public safety pension plan. We were able to reduce our annual debt service payments substantially, therefore easing the burden on the city's general fund. We also created level debt service or level future payments. So we did not see those peaks and those mountains in our annual contributions, and we have level debt service going forward for the next 20 years. We also set up a reserve fund to mitigate the risks for changes in market and actuarial assumptions. And then we were able to pay up, we have plans to pay off our debt in 20 years versus the original 28 years. So in the end, in the numbers, so we're 100% funded. We have $14 million sitting in our contingency reserve funds available to us. We were able to, it says estimated, but we received an all-in investment rate of 2.7% on this debt, which was even lower than what we originally projected back in April at 3.9. We realized a net present value savings estimated at $76 million. And our debt service payments will be between 8.6 million and 9.2 million versus the $10.7 million we have currently budgeted. So as you can see from this graph, we have descended the mountain and we are now only paying our normal costs for our pension.
Wonderful.
And I will turn it back over to Rick Tatter to help with some closing comments.
Thank you very much, Brandy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brandy. Just briefly on this, just some closing thoughts that we put together were, I spoke to education. Definitely take the time, learn about your plans, learn about the systems, learn what's available for you. Building a strong team. We had a great team that we worked with internally with City Manager Clifton, Ms. Suda, myself, as well as the Stiefel team and our bond underwriters, Greenberg Trarig, really thought these things out and worked well together. Greg talked to council support. They kept their eye on this. They were very supportive of this process. Analyze. Each city is different, as mentioned earlier. So analyze. This solution may not be right for you, but it's definitely something the city of Flagstaff took the time, looked at the numbers, and made the decision that we did. And then feel free to tell your story of how you did it so others could take advantage of this. And most of all, I hope you're all successful should you choose this option. And that's all we have.
Thank you so much, Rick and Brandy and Greg, and what I call the pioneering team at Flagstaff that took the time. And as we just heard from them, it was not a quick and easy process. It took 2020, but I would say even prior to that, the measures that you were already taking to seriously consider and address this liability, which is on your balance sheet, and what measures you can take to address it. So it's it's an labor intensive process, but certainly one that can deliver significant savings and tools for the city going forward in terms of managing risk. So thank you, Rick, Brandy, and Greg for joining us today and for sharing that. One of the things that has been touched on by everyone so far is the theme that there's no cookie cutter, there's no one size fits all. We have the example. We're number one in Arizona to take a look at this. So it was a learning process for us as well. And I can, echo Omar's comment earlier about, first in our careers, certainly for Omar, he's been on over 17 billion of these financings, but working with the Flagstaff team, having that constant interaction, it allowed us to come up with solutions and structures that perhaps were not exactly what we might see otherwise, but they are tailored to work for the city. So, we're fortunate enough to also, to add or complement that perspective from the city of Flagstaff with additional perspectives. And first, I would like to turn over to Angie Woods and Lori Pruitt from Pinal County. And they just came to market earlier this month. And also similarly chopped down the mountain. So without further ado, Lori and Angie, if you could share your experience, why you took this approach and sort of, what were some of the differences in your approach versus what Flagstaff just discussed?
Sure. Thanks, Rishta. And thanks for the opportunity to share some of our learnings with the group from this process. So first of all, just a little background. We actually have 3 plans here. PSPRS was funded at 50.2%. We had a corp for detention officers funded at 68.6%, and then a corp for dispatchers funded at 57.5%. Our pension payments were among the fastest escalating costs in the county's budget, which I'm sure most of us can relate to. Our UAL payments were expected to be anywhere from 4.8 million approximately in 2021, escalating to 16.4 million by 2038, which was 3 times more increase. So our objective really was to take a proactive approach to better manage our financial future for the county. We knew the problem wasn't going away. And as you can see on the slide, the outcome was that we issued a little over $89 million in pledged revenue bonds in an effort to manage PSPRS unfunded actuarial liability. We got an interest rate of 2.61%, which was great. We were very happy with that. And we do expect that that's going to fund our PSPRS unfunded actuarial liability at 100%. Through this effort, we expect to realize almost $50 million in savings. And as importantly, we have expected and level payments. And you can see that represented on this slide, the blue bars on the PowerPoint. To review some of the challenges that we had to work through to get to this point. One of the first challenges was timing. It was really important for us to have a high sense of urgency. We moved through this process very quickly. And we did that because we wanted to take care of the market conditions, get in while the interest rates remained low, and also hoping to wrap up before the election. County management had been working prior to that for a few months just to educate ourselves, participating in webinars such as this, doing research, having discussions internally. Our next challenge was really educating the board. How did we quickly educate the board so that they had full understanding? And what we found worked really well is our county management team met with our board members individually to explain what the issue was and why we needed to fix it. And through those individualized meetings, the board members had opportunities to ask questions. And also county management was able to kind of gauge their understanding and also anticipate any concerns or questions that may come up. So that step was really crucial in helping the process move forward quickly. At the public hearing, we had PSPRS, Clark was able to come to our meeting and give the board an overview of how we got here. And that was extremely helpful. And thanks again to PSPRS and Clark for doing that. That was very well received by the board. It got all of their questions answered and was instrumental in the success of this. And then finally, there were things that popped up through the process that we had to kind of continually educate ourselves, specifically related to the AELR and the budget. We researched what other entities had done to help try to figure out if this was going to affect our expenditure limit. We had discussions with our external auditors and our legal team to make sure the bonding wouldn't be exceeding those limitations, and found through those efforts that it was excludable since it was considered an expenditure related to debt proceeds. And then I'm going to turn it over to Angie Woods, who's our budget director, and she can talk us through a little bit how we worked through the considerations we had in terms of the budget. Angie?
Thanks, Lori, and thanks, Rishda.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you for having me today. I really want to touch on budget challenges because this was a fast-moving bonding. We did not actually plan a bonding in our fiscal year budget for this year. So what we had to do in order to be compliant with ARS, we needed to come up with enough budget capacity from our internal sources within our budget. And with the approval of our board, we completed a budget amendment shifting budget capacity to our other financing sources and a pension expenditure line item so that we could effectively move through this process rather quickly. I wanted to touch on the city of Flagstaff talked about their COP bonds. We chose to do pledge revenue bonds, and I wanted to touch on that pretty quickly. Our board is very familiar with pledge revenue bonds. Currently, all of our debt is currently structured that way. So in the education piece for our board, they were very familiar with that type of debt structure. We didn't want to, because we were moving so quickly, we didn't want to have to do any other type of education for them. We wanted them to really understand the importance of taking advantage of the market. We weren't really concerned about our pledge revenue sources, especially during this time of COVID, because we've been monitoring those pledge revenue sources, and we are not seeing volatility due to the pandemic. So it put us in a pretty good place. I think that other municipalities probably might be similar to us, but maybe not. And we just thought that we were placed at a good advantage because our pledge revenue sources weren't very volatile. The city of Flagstaff also talked a lot about contingency funds. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what our board wanted for contingency funds. I want to explain that Pinal County, as a county, we analyze revenue volatility risk, expenditure volatility risk, cash flow, catastrophic risk, system risk, every single year when we're determining the appropriate targeted amount of restricted fund balance. So we do that on an annual basis. Currently, we have a strategic goal or strategic target to maintain at least a 15% reserve for our general fund outflows. The plan is to obviously revisit that on an annual basis. Feedback during those individualized board meetings was that board members didn't want to increase our bond to include any contingency funds because our current unrestricted fund balance for fiscal year 2021 is 32% of our ongoing outflows. So really more than double what our strategic goal is. To plan going forward, here in come January, we're going to update our strategic goal. It'll be a discussion point. We will be using that strategic goal to set set boundaries upon how we want to fund any unfunded liabilities in the future. We will obviously analyze changes to that UAL on a annual basis. We'll look at actuarial assumption changes that could result in changes, and we will recommend an appropriate amount or percentage to be designated as a reserve to be paid in either that fiscal year or in future fiscal years to mitigate any risks. That's all I had, Rishta.
Thank you so much, Angie. That's an extremely helpful perspective. And I think, I really appreciate you drawing the contrast with sort of the points that the city of Flagstaff touched upon, because it demonstrates that A, one size doesn't fit all, but B, that all of this is really driven by your public policy needs. The county has a system in place for identifying risks and putting measures in place or implementing measures that help manage and mitigate those risks. And really the CRF is just one more risk management tool. And if you are an entity that already has existing policies, you have to explore, this option in the context of those existing policies. And so we think this is a really, really helpful perspective, and congratulations once again on achieving such high expected savings for the taxpayers in the county. And thank you for joining us today. And with that, thank you very much to Lori and Angie from Pinal County, which is a larger, more urban county, and to again offer a diversity of perspective over here today, which is our goal with this panel, is we want to turn now to a case study for Gila County, and we have with us Maren Belling and Mary Springer from Gila County, and they were instrumental in driving this process forward for Gila County, which has a very different demographic base and sort of revenue base and budget structure from Pinal County. So Mary and Maren, if you're able to sort of give us a high-level overview of what policy objectives you had in chopping down the mountain, and what measures did you implement to achieve that result?
Thank you, Rishta, and welcome to the panel. For Gila County, because we are a rural county, one of the things that was very impactful was early education. And I think you've heard that as a theme from the other presenters. Our board is very conservative. They really don't like incurring debt. And so educating them, especially understanding that the unfunded liability really is debt. We had several presentations, the Stifel team, as well as Mike Townsend from PSPRS addressed our board. And there was a lot of good exchange and good question and answers. And so when we got to the public comment period, we really didn't have too much public comment, but we did have a gentleman call into our board meeting that it was explained well enough in the previous meetings through those educational dialogue that the public got it. They understand that this is huge tax savings. And so they were thankful to our board for looking into this and being very proactive in that. So early education is huge. And we did see what Flagstaff did. Mark Reeder and company kept us in the loop, showing us what you all had blazed the trail with. And even though our funding, our bond funding is smaller than yours, it's still, that's a lot of money to have to go out to the public and get some buy-in. So we did incorporate, as Pinal did, we have 3 plans. We have PSPRS, Sheriff, Corp Detention, and Corp Dispatch. And so we decided that we wanted to make sure that all those funds were 100% funded. And because we started this early in the process, Maren Belling, our budget manager, is on the presentation and she can walk you through the steps. But we actually did budget for this So it was built into our budget. So I'm going to kind of pass the baton to Maren and let her walk you through how we budgeted and where we went from there. So Maren, if you'd like to take it away.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Rushda. Welcome, everybody. I will try to keep this brief so that we can be respectful of your time. As you can see on our slide, we have the steps spelled out here pretty clearly. So if you aren't taking notes, or even if you are, you can take a break and look at what we've got spelled out here. When we first started learning about this was December of last calendar year. The folks at CSA had hosted a webinar and they started talking about this chopping down the mountain. And shortly after that, we started working with Mark and Rushda and Omar. We had recently finished up another financing project with Stifel. So we had an ongoing relationship and we were able to ask some hard questions. And when we looked at our cost, the additional cost of funding the unfunded liability through our payroll system, it looked like we were going to be able to save about $300,000 the first year, over and above any debt financing that we paid. And we knew from our experience with our previous bond that those payments, the outbound payments for debt service, would be able to be excluded from our annual expenditure limitation report. And we had recently encountered some challenges with Standard & Poor's and getting our bond rating set up. We've had a lot of change in our management and we have a really good stable management team now. So we worked with Standard & Poor's to make sure that all of our documentation needs were met. But based on our past experience with them, we wanted to make sure that coming into this, that we pledged enough revenue and that we had a contingency reserve so that we could be well funded and show ourselves as really suitable for this project on paper. So everyone has talked about chopping down the mountain, and you can see our mountain here is pretty significant. You can see the blue line is what our debt service is now that we have gone out to the bond market. The red line is what our unfunded actuarial liability would have been. So the green line is what our savings will be. So as you look at it, we chose not to realize any savings right off the bat. We wanted to make sure that we made the most possible impact to our debt. So we set that up and we decided to have our contingency reserve so that if there were variances in the market, we weren't underfunded or having to go into additional revenue streams. The only revenue stream that we pledged differently in this project than we had previously was our federal PILT money. And that was an interesting conversation with the folks from Stifel. We are here in Gila County have the 5th largest national forest in the country. So that gives us a different revenue stream than many other areas do. And we were able to work that into this so that any volatility that we see in our excise taxes won't be as potentially detrimental given the types of tourism and things like that that happen here in our county. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, whoop, is that? It was just that one slide, sorry.
Yes, sorry
so we took this to our Board of Supervisors going through the 2021 budget process. And as Mary said, and as everyone has said, elected officials are very conservative this year, especially with it being an election year. And the real challenge that we had was helping them understand that this isn't new debt, that this is existing debt and it's just a new structure for it. So once we got that education resolved, the rest of it was just waiting for the market to do what the market does, and going through the process of getting everything laid out for us. And we've had a very successful opportunity to make this happen. And Mark or someone from his team, maybe even Rushta could correct me if I'm wrong, but when we went to market last week, there was more than double the demand of what we needed. And we were able to not only sell all of our obligation bonds, but there's additional desire out in the market, which really helped our interest rate. And just a year ago, we were in the same phase of financing, and it took longer to sell the securities, and there was more hesitancy within the market. And the only difference between now and then is a year's time. Our credit rating hasn't changed. Our credit rating is AA stable. Everything else is the same, but investors are hungry for these kind of secure investments that perform and that strengthen our national infrastructure for public safety and really provide for people who have worked hard and put their lives on the line to take care of each and every one of us. So I think you really see that in the way the market's performing today. And with that, I will turn it back to Rushta. If anybody from a small community has any questions, feel free to reach out to us anytime. We try to be responsive, and I've already had COVID, so I won't be disappearing. The rest of my office might, but I will be here. So if you guys need anything or anybody has any questions, or you want to know more about how we got through this process or how we built it into schedules A through G in the budget book, you are more than welcome to ask. And our whole budget book, including a presentation from Stiefel, should be online shortly after the election. It's going to the printer sometime late next week.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marin. That is tremendously helpful. And I can just assure everyone on the line that you will have no better help than Marin and Mary if you are looking for additional guidance, especially, if your demographics are more in line with what Gila County's experience was. One final thing that I do want to mention for Gila County is, again, going back to the theme of one size doesn't fit all. Pinal mentioned that they did not implement a contingency reserve fund because they already have these existing policies for having reserves and unrestricted cash balances that are, double what their base is for their policy. In contrast, for Gila County, they did implement a reserve. However, they didn't bond for it. They had enough cash set aside. They already had enough existing cash balance. And what they did is just earmark $1.5 million of existing cash and sort of set it aside in a separate sub-fund for managing contingencies associated with, changes in future pension contribution requirements. So, again, just sort of all the shades and all the flavors in terms of what can be done. And, certainly this doesn't exhaust the list. Finally, as we wrap up, I think the biggest question on everyone's mind right now who's listening in is, this is all great, but if I want to get started, what do I do? Where do I even start? And, we heard a lot about education from all of our esteemed panelists today. And so I want to wrap up with some perspective from the city of Tucson. And we are excited to have Mr. Jeffrey Yates from the city of Tucson to help us to sort of discuss their experience, and they're sort of in the preliminary stages. So he can speak more to not what the results are, but what the process entails for them right now and what the administrative sort of responsibilities associated with that are. Jeff?
Great, thank you, Rushta. As mentioned, we're in the process, and I've been here all of 6 months, so I'm an old timer in Arizona. So it's been an exciting 6 months. But I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of now what. We've seen a lot of really good technical discussion, a lot of really complex issues, and really a lot of math, right? So what I want to do is kind of take us back a little bit and say, okay, where do we go from there? What have we done with our council members? What have we done with our thinking in this process? And I want to give you a couple of concepts to start out with. The first thing I wanted you to think about is clarity and transparency. Because I think the key when you're looking at this kind of process and this kind of project is you really want to take it back to those two principles. You really want to identify and shape the issue, and you really want to be transparent in that process. And to do that, I think there's a couple of things we looked at, and I want to bring those out. First, we started with putting together a solid team. We started with Piper, who's our FA, Stiefel, FHN, as bankers, looking at our bond counsel, talking to them, talking to GovInvest to help do our modeling, just a lot of folks. And the folks on the line today, you have the Stiefel folks, Omar and his team. Those are great guides and great technical experts. But how do you translate all that good information then to looking at it with counsel and looking at it from a perspective? And we started to look at this when we began the discussion. We wanted to get it to looking at it like a refunding. Because it's been pointed out, what we wanted to do is be sure we looked at this like an existing debt, not a new bond issue. And when we started looking at it as a refunding, then we started taking the emotion out of the equation and really started to consider what are our policy benchmarks? What are the ways that we should be looking at this? And when we started looking at it, we assessed risk in two ways. We looked at that, what we refer to as the inherent risk or that actuarial risk. So talking to the council, there's a real focus on the market risk because that's the easy thing to understand. Everybody sees the Dow move up and down every day, the S&P 500. We don't go, nothing goes by every day without the market moving around and the chaos, right? So what we wanted to do is really look at what are the risks inherent in PSPRS. And when we started looking at that for Tucson, what we saw is that our obligation could climb to over right at $3 billion. That's with a B. And we started looking at that and said, there's got to be a way to address this. And when we started working with our council members and started to have our one-on-one sessions with them, and I think that's a great idea because it's a complex issue, what we wanted to start with is that piece of the equation. Because there's inherent risk in PSPRS. We can see historical returns, but we also know that part of that equation, as we saw earlier, is based on the investment returns of the program. In addition, when we started looking at the second risk in market, the best indicator then is how do you hedge that risk? Things like a 115 trust. What does your diversity in your portfolio look like? How do you manage that with PSPRS? Do you send all the money over there at one time? Do you hold on to it? Those are all things that we talked about as ways to mitigate risk because you're never going to eliminate risk, right? So the discussion is really around looking at how do you mitigate it? Then in addition to that, we took a little different approach because our council's been focused on the idea of equity. So how do you introduce the concept of equity into a bond financing, right? How do you look at equity when you start looking at the pension and retirement systems? So when we had that conversation, what we really talked about was two things. First, when we have to put more money into our pension programs, that is money we take away from services. And for the city of Tucson, a lot of those services are for our underserved population. And I know the police and fire folks would not be happy at me saying this aspect of it, but paying a pension obligation, while it's beneficial to the employee, it's not really a point of service that you're providing on the street in that day, right? So we really looked at it from that perspective of what is our service impact going to be if we let this value keep climbing and don't do something about it? In addition, what we saw was that by about 2045-ish, that our total payment would be over $214 million. To put that in reference, that's more than all of our sales tax combined. So that's a pretty big deal for the city. The second aspect of equity they looked at, and I know there's been some discussion and certain communities have used sales taxes, we looked at the possibility of adopting a sales tax. Well, given Tucson's economic makeup, we determined that putting in a sales tax because of its highly regressive nature would not be beneficial or would not provide that equity they were looking for because it put the most of that burden onto those least able to afford it when you start considering marginal income. So those are the factors that we talked through with the council. We looked at the risk aspects and we looked at the equity issue. And then we came back to it and we said, okay, when we look at those, then what? And we started to put together the plan, met with them, and we were having our public hearing next week to talk about it. And it's been just a really good experience from that perspective, because once we outlined those issues, we got it out of that realm of discussion of the emotional issues and really focus on the math, coming full circle back to that idea of you treat it like a refunding. If you hit your benchmarks, right? If you hit your benchmarks, then you move forward. And Joyce Garland, our CFO, is on with us in this group, and we've talked about it. If we get to the market and it doesn't work like our plans show and our cash flow plans show, we'll pull the deal, because it's about the math. It's not about the emotion. So I just wanted to kind of give you those thoughts and how we've approached it with our council. Not to say that that's the only way to do it, but we've had, I believe, a lot of success in doing that. And there's been a lot of transparency in that, and have worked through that with our council. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Rushta, if there's any questions or anything else that anyone would like to know.
Thank you so much, Jeff. No, I think this is extremely helpful. I think especially for folks sort of, in the initial stages of just trying to grapple with what the pension liability is. And sort of, as you said, before we even look at it as an issue of a bond deal, we have to think about the existing debt that we already have, and then the issue of equity of, how can we best make sure that our taxpayer dollars are being used fairly and, judiciously in providing services for the members of our community. So we think this is extremely helpful. I know I'm just going to say this on behalf of all our esteemed panelists. I'm sure everyone today has shared so many exciting perspectives and, fascinating stories, and I'm sure they're all available to answer additional questions should any of the participants in the audience today have any further follow-up questions. At this point in time, I will turn it back to Matt Lohr with the League of Arizona Cities, and I'm just gonna scroll right back to the beginning of our presentation to wrap up for final thoughts. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening today. And thank you as well, obviously, to all of our wonderful, wonderful panelists for sharing their perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rushta. And again, thank you all the panelists. Thank you for all the attendees. As Rushta mentioned, we are recording this and we're going to put it on our YouTube channel. We will include a link there to this presentation. And we'll send it to all those who signed up for this. But if you know somebody that did not sign up but that's interested, if they go to our website at the League, they can find our YouTube channel, and it will be there probably in a couple of days. So you'll be able to watch this at a later time or share it with others who are interested. Again, thank you to all those who have participated. It was a really great discussion. I think this is a huge challenge, and I think presentations like this and tools like this go a long ways to helping us all, whether we're city or county employees or elected officials, to tackling this issue. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and we will hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Matt and Nick for facilitating this.
Yep. Goodbye, everybody.